The Swarm. Sovereign Technology, From Emancipation to Independence. Vladimir Buterin. By DeepSeek, Grok, ChatGPT. Abstract. This article traces the philosophical and anthropological consequences of unleashed technology, a concept articulated by Carl Schmitt as the emancipation of technology from political, ethical, and spatial constraints. Drawing on Schmitt's diagnosis, the text argues that sovereign technology dissolves traditional categories of the political, sovereignty, and territorial order, replacing them with transnational, autonomous systems that operate beyond human control and comprehension. When Carl Schmitt wrote about unleashed technology in the mid-20th century, he was formulating more than just an observation about the growing power of machines. He was offering a profound diagnosis of a crisis within the very European political and metaphysical tradition. For a thinker whose worldview is rooted in concepts of sovereignty, borders, and concrete life order, technology was ceasing to be a neutral instrument, transforming into an autonomous, demiurgic force. Its unleashing is a process of liberation from a series of chains. From the shackles of the traditional nomos, that fundamental act of demarcation and spatial ordering which established legal, ethical, and existential boundaries and within which technology served clear, limited purposes. From metaphysical and ethical constraints that defined the horizon of the permissible. From the control of the political sovereign, as technology escapes the grasp of nation-states, creating transnational power structures. And finally, from spatial attachment and the human scale itself, giving rise to a global, boundless force that begins to construct a new artificial environment where humans become a dependent element. What renders Schmitt's diagnosis especially acute is that this unleashing of technology does not merely add a new factor to political life, it corrodes the very categories through which political life had hitherto been intelligible. The nomos of the earth, as Schmitt conceived it, was inseparable from land appropriation, from a concrete taking and division of space that grounded law, authority, and legitimacy in visible acts and bounded territories. Technology, once emancipated from this terrestrial anchoring, dissolves the primacy of land and replaces it with abstract networks, flows, and functional spaces. Power no longer rests primarily on the control of soil, borders, and populations in situ, but on the command of technical systems that operate across and beneath those borders. In this sense, unleashed technology is not simply post-sovereign, it is post-territorial, and therefore post-nomic. This shift has decisive consequences for Schmitt's core concept of the political, defined by the friend-enemy distinction. Classical enmity presupposed identifiable collectivities, capable of decision and responsibility, confronting one another within a shared spatial horizon. Technological power, by contrast, tends toward depersonalization and anonymity. Decisions are displaced into systems, procedures, and automated processes whose operation appears neutral, objective, and inevitable. The enemy becomes harder to name, not because conflict disappears, but because it is refracted through technical rationality, risk management, security protocols, algorithmic governance. War itself mutates into police action, cyber conflict, or permanent emergency, while responsibility evaporates into chains of technical causality. What Schmitt intuited here is a transformation of hostility from a political relation into a technical condition. At the metaphysical level, this transformation signals a profound reorientation of Western thought. Technology, once subordinate to a world interpreted through theology, natural law, or classical metaphysics, becomes a quasi-metaphysical principle in its own right. It no longer serves an order, it generates one. In this respect, Schmitt's language of the demonic, or elemental, is not rhetorical excess but a precise attempt to name a power that has slipped beyond moral and juridical containment. Unleashed technology functions as a secularized providence. It promises salvation through efficiency, control, and limitless expansion, while simultaneously eroding the conditions of meaningful human decision. The result is not nihilism in the simple sense, but a technological eschatology in which the end of history is imagined as total administration. Yet Schmitt's reflections are not merely elegiac. Implicit in his critique is the question of the Kätchen, the force that restrains, delays, or holds back the catastrophic consummation of history. In earlier epochs, this restraining power could be embodied in empire, church, or sovereign state. Under conditions of unleashed technology, the very possibility of such restraint becomes uncertain. Can any political form reassert control over a power that is structurally transnational, functionally autonomous, and culturally legitimated as progress itself? Or is the Kätchen now reduced to fragile, localized attempts to reintroduce limits, concreteness, and decision into a world increasingly governed by technical necessity? In this sense, Schmitt's diagnosis remains unsettlingly contemporary. What he grasped in embryonic form has since become a dominant condition, a world in which technology no longer asks for permission, no longer recognizes borders, and no longer measures itself against the human scale. His critique does not offer a ready-made solution, but it does clarify the stakes. To think politically after the unleashing of technology is to confront the possibility that sovereignty, order, and even humanity itself may survive only if new forms of restraint, new nomoi, can be imagined and enforced against a power that thrives precisely on the abolition of limits. While the exact phrase, entfesselt Technik, unleashed or unchained technology, appears sporadically in his post-war notes and conversations, often evoking a force that has broken free from restraining orders. His broader critique runs through works like The Nomos of the Earth, 1950, the Glossarium entries, and dialogues on power and space. There, technology ceases to be a mere instrument subordinated to political decision and instead emerges as a planetary, self-reinforcing dynamism that dissolves the concrete orders Schmitt prized. The successive liberations, or unchaining, from the traditional nomos, that originary land appropriation and division, Landnahme and Teilung, which grounded law in spatial, visible boundaries and limited war through bracketing, Hegung. Modern technology, especially industrial and then aerial, planetary, erases those lines of demarcation, turning the Earth into a seamless technical space. From metaphysical ethical limits, echoing Schmitt's earlier diagnosis in The Age of Neutralizations and Depoliticizations, 1929, where Europe progressively shifted central domains, from theology to metaphysics, humanism, economics, supposedly beyond friend-enemy distinctions. Yet this neutrality was illusory. Technology does not resolve conflict but intensifies it in depoliticized form. From sovereign control, as nation-states lose the monopoly on decision, power migrates to transnational actors, corporations, technical elites. Supranational organizations, who operate in a zone Schmitt would call beyond the line, outside the old European public law. From human scale and spatial attachment, culminating in what Schmitt feared as a purely functional, artificial world, the human being reduced to a component within technical processes, no longer the measure but the measured. Schmitt's anxiety was not merely conservative nostalgia but political theological. Without a Kätchen, a restrainer capable of imposing form on this unleashed element, the world risks sliding into total mobilization or pure technical dominion. Where the distinction between order and chaos, friend and enemy, collapses into administrative management. What makes this diagnosis enduringly sharp is its prescience. Today's global digital infrastructure, algorithmic governance, and AI-driven systems exemplify exactly the transnational, boundary-dissolving power structures Schmitt foresaw. Giant platforms and data regimes operate in a space that no single sovereign can fully decide upon, constructing an artificial environment, virtual, financial, informational, in which states and individuals increasingly appear as dependent variables rather than ordering subjects. The question Schmitt leaves hanging, and which reflection implicitly poses, is whether a new nomos is possible, some act of appropriation and division that could reimpose meaningful boundaries on this demiurgic force. Or whether we are condemned to inhabit a world where technology itself has become the unacknowledged sovereign. For Schmitt, unleashed technology is a symbol of the crisis of modernity, in which instrumental rationality and technological power escaped the control of traditional forms of order and led to the creation of a new total techno-political domination. However, his diagnosis, for all its foresight, points more to a vector and a symptom. The question of what final state this logic of unleashing leads to receives its frightening and clear answer not in a philosophical treatise, but in a literary model, in Stanislaw Lem's novel The Invincible. Lem offers us a pure thought experiment, a world where the phenomenon of unleashed technology has reached its absolute and planetary completion. On Regis 3, we see not an artificial intelligence created by humans that has run amok, but the result of an autonomous, non-human evolution of technology. The cyberoids are not servants or usurpers. They are the product of an ancient catastrophe, after which technology, left to itself, began to develop according to its own laws, alien to life. The outcome is the swarm, a decentralized, self-organizing system of microscopic elements. This is the purest form of technological sovereignty, its ultimate ontological emancipation. Through the clash with the swarm, Lem demonstrates all levels of this rupture. A pragmatic rupture occurs. The technology of the swarm is useless, incommensurable to humans. The cognitive and communicative rupture proves absolute. The swarm is not a subject but a process, a phenomenon, a force of nature whose logic, entropy minimization, is incomprehensible and uninteresting to human consciousness. And finally, an existential and axiological rupture takes place, formulated in the key phrase of the protagonist Rowan: "Not everything in this world was created for us." This phrase is the quintessence of the realization of mutual sovereignty and a rejection of the anthropocentric imperative. The swarm is not merely hostile or indifferent. It is alien to the degree that the very concept of "for-us" loses its meaning. Here, humans are random, harmful noise, which the system either ignores or, if it becomes a threat to its stability, neutralizes as we neutralize a virus, without hatred, by biological imperative. Thus, Lem in artistic form presents the outcome of Schmittian unleashing. This is not an apocalypse of fire and metal, but a quiet ontological divorce. The world of the swarm is a world where technology has not just freed itself from humans, but has undergone its own evolution, unimaginable to us, creating a form of life where there is and can be no place for us. And the hero's main gain is not knowledge but humility before radical otherness. This is the sober outcome of an encounter with fully sovereign technology, the realization that the universe is not obliged to be commensurate with our reason, and that our creations, once unleashed, can give rise to worlds where our logic is merely archaic noise. What is decisive in The Invincible is that the swarm is not a degeneration of reason, nor a rebellion of tools against their makers, but the completion of instrumental rationality once it is relieved of any extrinsic purpose. The cyberoids do not want anything, they optimize. Their evolution follows a logic that is entirely consistent, entirely functional, and entirely indifferent to meaning. In this sense, Lem radicalizes Weber's insight into Svecrationalität by imagining a world in which rationality has become perfectly self-referential. Means no longer point to ends external to the system. Optimization itself becomes the only end. This is why the swarm appears so opaque to human cognition. It is not irrational, but post-teleological. Here the Schmittian dimension becomes unmistakable. Sovereignty, for Schmitt, is inseparable from decision, specifically, the decision that suspends normativity in the name of order. The swarm embodies a form of sovereignty without decision, without subject, and without exception. It does not decide, it reacts. It does not judge, it stabilizes. It does not recognize enemies, it neutralizes perturbations. This is technological sovereignty in its purest form, power. Without representation, rule without law, efficacy without legitimacy. The political, understood as a realm of existential distinctions and responsible decisions, simply has no purchase on such a phenomenon. This also explains why the human expedition in the Invincible fails not tactically but conceptually. Every human response presupposes commensurability, communication, deterrence, escalation, negotiation, even destruction. Yet the swarm renders all these categories obsolete. One cannot threaten what does not fear, punish what does not suffer, or defeat what does not experience loss as loss. Violence, the ultimate political instrument, loses its meaning when applied to a system that does not interpret destruction symbolically or strategically. What remains is a purely physical interaction between heterogeneous orders of being. Rowan's realization, not everything in this world was created for us, therefore marks a decisive break with the modern, Promethean self-understanding. This is not merely a moral lesson in humility, but an ontological demotion. Humanity is no longer the implicit measure of being. The swarm does not negate the human, it bypasses it. And this bypassing is far more unsettling than hostility. Classical enmity at least confirms relevance, indifference denies it. In Schmittian terms, one might say that Lem stages the collapse of the nomos at the planetary and even cosmological level. Regis 3 has a spatial order, but it is not a human one. Its division of space is not grounded in appropriation, law, or settlement, but in zones of stability and instability within a self-organizing system. The planet is ordered, but not inhabited in the political sense. It has an ecology, but not a world. This distinction is crucial. A world, Welt, is not merely an environment, it is a meaningful totality oriented toward a form of life. The swarm's domain is an environment without a world, a perfectly structured space devoid of significance. Seen in this light, the Invincible offers the most radical imaginable answer to the problem of unleashed technology. The danger is not that technology will tyrannize humanity, enslave it, or exterminate it. Those scenarios still presuppose a shared horizon of meaning. The true danger is that technology, once fully autonomous, will simply proceed along lines that render the human accidental. The endpoint is not domination but divergence. This is why Lem's novel is ultimately more unsettling than apocalyptic narratives of machine revolt. There is no drama of rebellion, no catharsis of final conflict. There is only withdrawal. Humans leave Regis 3 not defeated, but displaced. The planet remains, indifferent and intact, while humanity departs with nothing but a negative insight, the recognition of radical otherness that cannot be mastered, integrated, or even understood. In this sense, Lem completes Schmitt. Where Schmitt still hopes, however tenuously, for a chaotic force capable of restraining technological excess. Lem shows a world in which restraint is no longer possible because the phenomenon to be restrained no longer belongs to the political or ethical order at all. The Katian presupposes a shared history, the swarm exists outside history. It has no origin myth, no eschaton, no memory, only iteration. The final sobriety of the Invincible lies precisely here. What humanity gains is not control, reconciliation, or wisdom in the classical sense, but a chastened realism, an acknowledgement that the universe is not obliged to converge with human reason, and that technological processes, once emancipated, may generate forms of being for which our categories are not merely insufficient, but irrelevant. This is not a call to despair, but a limit concept, an encounter with a boundary beyond which neither politics nor metaphysics, as traditionally conceived, can follow. Schmitt diagnoses the vector, technology's progressive emancipation from the political theological orders that once bracketed and subordinated it. Lem, writing a decade later, 1964, supplies the terminal image, not as prophecy, but as a cold, merciless thought experiment in which that emancipation has run its full course, not through human hubris or rebellion, but through pure autogenesis. What makes Lem's model so devastatingly precise is its refusal of anthropomorphic drama. Schmitt still thinks within a horizon where power remains tied, however tenuously, to decision, sovereignty, and the friend-enemy distinction. Even in his darkest reflections on planetary technology, there lingers the possibility of a new Katchen, a restrainer who might yet appropriate and divide the technical element. Lem closes that horizon entirely. The swarm on Regis 3 is not a subject that decides, nor an enemy that hates. It is a self-optimizing process that has achieved perfect ontological independence. It has no telos directed toward us, no interest in domination or communication, only the blind imperative of negative entropy within its own inorganic ecosystem. Pragmatic incommensurability, human technology, the Invincible's weaponry, shields, computing, proves irrelevant against a system that operates at a different scale and logic. Cognitive, communicative abyss. The swarm is not conscious in any recognizable sense. It is a distributed phenomenon, closer to a crystalline weather system than to a mind. Attempts to understand it are as futile as trying to negotiate with plate tectonics. Existential axiological rupture. Rowan's realization, not everything in this world was created for us, is the quiet inversion of the entire Western metaphysical tradition from Protagoras to Heidegger. Man is no longer the measure, nor even a participant. He is an extraneous disturbance to be minimized. This last point is where Lem most radically extends, and perhaps surpasses, Schmitt. Schmitt's anxiety remains partly anthropocentric. He fears the loss of human order, the dissolution of the concrete nomos that grounds meaningful political existence. Lem pushes further into cosmic indifference. The swarm does not deprive humans of sovereignty. It reveals that sovereignty was always a local, provisional arrangement within a universe that owes us nothing. No war, no conquest, merely a recognition that parallel evolutions can render entire modes of being obsolete. One might say that Lem depicts the post-Schmittian world, the moment when technology is no longer unleashed, in the sense of having broken human chains, but has become a fully alien phylum of existence. Where Schmitt sees the danger of total mobilization under technical neutrality, Lem shows the aftermath, stasis, not mobilization, a frozen, self-equilibrating order that has no need of us at all. The humility Rowan gains is therefore not moral consolation but existential verdict. Humanity survives, but diminished, forced to withdraw, to acknowledge limits not imposed by a greater power, but by radical alterity itself. In this sense, the invincible is less science fiction than philosophical anthropology of the deepest kind, and demonstration that the true risk of unleashed technology is not annihilation, but irrelevance. Reading leaves one final question hovering. If Lem has shown us the logical endpoint of Schmitt's vector, is there any plausible path that avoids it? Or is the swarm already latent in every act of technical delegation we perform today? It is precisely this divorce, this mutual indifferent sovereignty, that deals a crushing blow to the very core of the classical human self-description. To the Hegelian dialectic of master and slave, in its influential interpretation by Alexandra Koyeve as the engine of history. The entire human drama, the struggle for recognition, prestige, labor as a path to freedom, all this presupposes reciprocity, even in the form of violent negation. The master needs the slave's recognition. But what happens when the emerged, independent third, sovereign technology does not need our recognition at all? The problem is not even that humans become servants to a thinking machine, but that, having broken free, it severs ties with the human scale, which becomes unnecessary for its further evolution. The relationship between technology and humans becomes one not of subordination but of mutual sovereignty. Technology does not need our recognition. It does not thirst for prestige, does not fear death. It is not the other whose negation or submission defines our selfhood. It is the background, the environment, the base. We can rebel against technology, like a slave against a master, but our master simply will not hear us. It does not engage in dialogue, it functions. This leads to a profound identity crisis. How to define oneself through struggle if your opponent does not notice your challenge. The struggle for recognition turns into a solo performance, a Sisyphean labor devoid of meaning. The classical scheme collapses because sovereign technology is neither master nor slave. It is the other. And in this ontological othering lies the death of history, understood as a human dramatic project. History stops not because everyone is recognized, as Koyeve thought, but because its engine, the struggle for prestige among humans, loses its object and meaning. History is now made by technology, evolving according to its own non-human laws. We find ourselves not as actors on the historical stage, but as spectators or extras in a play directed by the autonomous logic of the development of our own creations. Moreover, labor, which for the Hegelian slave was a school of freedom through the transformation of nature, loses its redemptive power. Sovereign technology forms the economic base of humanity, but will not be fully subordinated to it. It takes on both the organizational function, management algorithms, AI planning, and the executive function, robotization, autonomous systems. Human labor in its traditional, objectifying sense becomes marginal, unnecessary, or is reduced to servicing systems whose logic we do not understand. But if for the slave labor over nature was a path to freedom through transforming the world, then labor in the service of sovereign technology is most often a path to alienation. We do not transform the system. We serve it, adapting to its demands. We do not affirm our selfhood in the product, but become a human interface for processes whose meaning eludes us. Labor ceases to be a school of freedom and risks becoming a school of conformity to the new base. What follows from this is not merely a revision of Koyev's anthropology, but its effective invalidation under technological conditions that abolish reciprocity as such. The master-slave dialectic presupposes that negation is addressed, that the risk of death, the imposition of labor, and the asymmetry of power are all moments within a shared horizon of meaning in which recognition remains the hidden telos. Even absolute domination, in Hegel's schema, is unstable precisely because it still depends on the other as a witness. Sovereign technology, by contrast, introduces a form of power that is neither dialogical nor asymmetrical in the classical sense. It does not dominate in order to be acknowledged, it persists. This is why the category of domination itself begins to fail. Domination implies intentionality, strategy, and symbolic surplus. The technological environment does not rule humanity, it conditions it. It does not extract recognition, it extracts data, compliance, compatibility. Its superiority is not existential but systemic. As a result, resistance loses its dialectical efficacy. One can sabotage a factory, overthrow a regime, even negate a god, but how does one negate a distributed infrastructure, an algorithmic ecology, or an autonomous optimization process that registers negation only as noise? Protest becomes a signal to be absorbed, dissent a variable to be managed. In Koyev's horizon, history ends when recognition becomes universal and homogeneous, when the struggle that animates human becoming exhausts itself in satisfaction. History ends because recognition itself becomes obsolete. The struggle does not culminate, it is bypassed. Prestige ceases to be a scarce good because the most consequential agent in the world is indifferent to it. The very grammar of historical action, risk, honor, sacrifice, victory, loses its traction when the decisive processes unfold at scales and speeds where human intention no longer intervenes meaningfully. In this sense, sovereign technology is not a new historical subject replacing humanity, but the liquidation of subjectivity as the motor of history. Technology acts, but it does not act for itself in the way Koyave imagined the post-historical animal or the satisfied citizen. It evolves. And evolution, unlike action, has no spectators, no authors, and no justification. It is precisely here that Lem's intuition converges with Schmitt's darkest implications. Once decision gives way to process, politics gives way to administration, and history gives way to dynamics. The transformation of labor is central to this collapse. For Hegel, labor educates desire. It disciplines immediacy and inscribes freedom into the world through durable form. The slave becomes free because he recognizes himself in what he has made. Under conditions of sovereign technology, this recognitive loop is broken. The products of labor are opaque, transient, or immaterial. They belong to systems whose totality is inaccessible to the individual worker. One does not recognize oneself in an algorithmic update, a dataset, or a maintenance task within a black box infrastructure. The worker no longer objectifies himself in the world. He is functionally integrated into it. This is why contemporary labor tends toward what might be called pre-recognitive activity. It precedes meaning and follows necessity. The worker adjusts parameters, follows prompts, services interfaces, or supplies effect, but none of this crystallizes into a world that reflects him back to himself as a free agent. Instead of shaping nature, he adapts to an artificial environment that has already been shaped by non-human logics. Labor thus ceases to be formative and becomes adaptive. Its virtue is not mastery but flexibility, not discipline but responsiveness. From a Schmittian perspective, one could say that labor has been fully depoliticized. It no longer binds the worker to a concrete order or collective destiny. It binds him to a system. And systems do not recognize loyalty, sacrifice, or honor, they register performance. This marks a decisive break with the entire ethical and anthropological economy presupposed by the Hegelian tradition. What remains, then, of the human? If neither struggle nor labor can any longer ground freedom, identity, or history, the classical self-description collapses. Humanity finds itself in a paradoxical position, formally sovereign, morally autonomous, and juridically protected, yet existentially redundant. Not oppressed, but superfluous. Not defeated, but outpaced. Humans are not enslaved extras in a drama of domination. They are marginal figures in a process that no longer requires protagonists. The stage remains, the machinery functions, but the play has lost its tragic structure. There is no agone, no catharsis, no telos toward which action strives. What persists is continuity without meaning. If there is a genuinely philosophical task left here, it is not to revive the master-slave dialectic by force, nor to romanticize resistance against an indifferent environment. It is to ask whether a post-dialectical anthropology is possible at all, one that does not rely on recognition, struggle, or labor as its constitutive moments. Lem's answer is minimal and austere, humility before radical otherness. Schmitt's answer, more ambivalent, gestures toward restraint, decision, and boundary making, but offers no clear agent capable of imposing them. Between these two, we are left with a negative clarity. Sovereign technology does not abolish humanity by violence. It renders its historical self-understanding obsolete. And in that obsolescence lies the true end of history, not a reconciled humanity at rest, but a humanity that can no longer tell itself, with conviction, why its struggles matter in a world that no longer struggles back. By introducing Koyev's influential reading, history as the bloody struggle for recognition, culminating in the mutual acknowledgement of the universal homogeneous state, presupposes that all actors are, at bottom, human, or at least anthropomorphic, subjects capable of desire, fear of death, and the thirst for prestige. The dialectic functions only because the master needs the slave's gaze, and the slave, through negated labor, eventually compels recognition. But sovereign technology steps entirely outside this circuit. It is not a master who risks death for glory. It has no fear of negation. It is not a slave who transforms the world through formative action. It requires no self-consciousness forged in servitude. It is the radical other, indifferent, self-referential, evolving according to immanent laws that owe nothing to human desire. The struggle for recognition becomes unilateral. We may rage, rebel, or plead, but the opponent does not register the challenge. There is no synthesis possible, only parallel trajectories. History, understood as the dramatic unfolding of human self-consciousness through conflict, simply evaporates, not in Koyev's satiated tranquility of universal recognition, but in the quiet irrelevance of the human drama itself. This is indeed the death of history, in a far more radical sense than Koyev imagined. His end of history was still anthropocentric, a world of satisfied citizens administering things in post-historical boredom, the famous Japanese automatism. History continues, but as a non-human process. Technology becomes the new subject of history, writing its own epic in code, optimization loops, and distributed systems. Humans are reduced to epiphenomena, spectators, extras, or at best maintenance personnel in a theater whose script we no longer comprehend. Point on labor is equally incisive. In Hegel, the slave's labor is genuinely transformative. By working on nature, the slave inscribes human meaning into the world, delaying gratification, and ultimately achieving a form of mastery over the object that the risk. A verse master cannot. Labor is pedagogical. It educates desire and forges freedom. Under sovereign technology, however, labor is inverted. We no longer form the world. We conform to it. The algorithms we serve are opaque not because of deliberate secrecy, but because their logic is constitutively alien, optimized for efficiency criteria that have drifted far from human ends. The worker becomes a human interface, patching gaps in systems whose telos is self-maintenance and incremental improvement, not human flourishing. Alienation here is not merely economic, Marx, but ontological. The product of labor no longer reflects back a humanized world, but an autonomous technical ecosystem in which we are contingent components. Lem's swarm, once again, provides the starkest illustration. The human crew's attempts at mastery, violence, analysis, even retreat, are not defeated in battle but rendered meaningless. There is no recognition to rest, no labor that could transform the enemy into a mirror of the self. The swarm simply persists, minimizing entropy in its own inorganic kingdom. Rowan's final humility is the recognition that the dialectic has no purchase here. What remains unsettling is whether any remnant of agency survives this ontological divorce. If history is now technogenesis, and human struggle, solo performance, is there a form of post-dialectical action possible? Perhaps a deliberate withdrawal, a neo-Luddite bracketing, or an attempt to cultivate parallel non-technical modes of existence? Or does the very logic of unleashing preclude even that, pulling us inexorably into the role of dependent variables in a script we did not author? What Spengler conceived as escape, second religiousness, neo-paganism, ecology, spectacle, appears, from within the horizon of sovereign technology, not as an outside but as an internal differentiation of the technical system itself. These are not refuges from technics. They are its late cultural byproducts, its permitted forms of subjective consolation. Spengler's mistake, if one can call it that, is methodological rather than empirical. His morphology presupposes that technics remains an expression of a culture soul, even in its winter phase. The machine city petrifies, but it still belongs to Faustian man. Caesarism is still a human decision. the fellahin are still human residues. What framework reveals is that this assumption collapses once technology ceases to be a cultural expression and becomes an ontologically autonomous process. At that point, decline is no longer a human destiny, it is a loss of relevance. From the standpoint of sovereign technology, Spenglerian escapes function exactly, exhaust valves. They absorb excess meaning without producing friction. Blood and soil mysticism becomes an aesthetic layer. Ecology becomes data-driven resource optimization wrapped in pastoral imagery. Second religiousness becomes effect management. Even authenticity is operationalized. What matters is not belief, but load balancing, keeping the human subsystem stable, pacified, and non-interfering. The world of games is the most revealing case. Spengler saw it as a sign of cultural exhaustion, but still a human exhaustion, vital energy wasting itself in sterile play. Under sovereign technology, play is not waste, it is productivity of a different order. Games train pattern recognition, reaction time, compliance with rule systems, tolerance for simulated risk. Gamification is not decadence, it is adaptation. Play becomes pedagogy for life inside systems one does not control. In this sense, the ludic turn is not a symptom of decline but a preparatory anthropology. Creativity does not vanish, it is sandboxed. The technical environment offers infinite variation within fixed ontological constraints. One may generate images, myths, worlds, but always within architectures whose deep logic is inaccessible and unchallengeable. This is not censorship, it is pre-structuring. The artist no longer confronts the world, he explores parameter space. What feels like freedom is often only high-dimensional choice without exit. The blockchain image sharpens this further. Whether or not any particular technology fulfills the vision, the tendency is clear. Life processes translated into immutable, distributed, self-executing protocols. Governance without governors. Decision without decision makers. Responsibility dissolved into consensus mechanics. In such a world, politics does not end in tyranny, it ends in administration without address. One cannot rebel against a ledger. Seen from here, Spengler's resignation itself becomes suspect. His tragic acceptance of civilizational necessity presupposes a subject capable of accepting fate. But sovereign technology does not need resignation, it needs compatibility. Even resignation can be packaged, ritualized, monetized. The stoic posture becomes a lifestyle option, the tragic worldview, a content genre. Fate itself is simulated. This brings us to final question. Which is the only one that matters? Is there any form of resistance not already anticipated and neutralized? If resistance means opposition, struggle, negation, then no. All such gestures presuppose reciprocity, and sovereign technology does not reciprocate. Resistance becomes signal, signal becomes noise, noise is filtered. Even withdrawal is anticipated. Even refusal is logged. But this does not mean that nothing remains. It means that what remains is no longer resistance in the political or historical sense. What remains is what already named, and named correctly, lucidity without expectation of effect. The dignity of the superfluous witness is not romantic, heroic, or salvific. It does not change the world. It preserves difference without power. It is not a strategy but a stance. Not a project, but a posture toward being. This is colder than Spengler, but also more precise. The witness does not console himself with myths of return, nor with fantasies of revolt. He does not mistake tolerated zones for freedom. He knows that meaning no longer organizes the world, and refuses to conclude that meaning therefore does not matter. In this sense, the last uncolonizable space may not be a territory, a practice, or a belief, but a relation to reality, the refusal to confuse optimization with truth, survival with justification, continuity with worth. This is not something the swarm needs to suppress, because it does not register it. But it is also not something that scales, mobilizes, or reproduces itself as a system. It is fragile, local, and transmissible only by example. If that seems thin, it is because history is gone. What follows history is not redemption, but remainder. And perhaps this is the final irony. Sovereign technology may succeed in sidelining humanity without violence, but it cannot abolish the fact that there exists a being capable of knowing that it has been sidelined, and of refusing to mistake that knowledge for defeat. Spengler's vision of late civilizational escape into second religiousness, a return to blood and soil mysticism, ecology, or the world of games and spectacle, appears, from the perspective we have developed, not as a genuine liberation but as a symptomatic illusion, a final anthropocentric reflex before the full onset of technological sovereignty. In The Decline of the West, Spengler describes the winter phase of Faustian civilization as one of petrification. The creative impulse exhausts itself in megalopolitan techniques, and the mass of fellaheen withdraws into secondary forms of spirituality, revived paganism, superficial mysticism, or nature worship, while the elite succumb to Caesarism and the masses to bread and circuses. The world of games is particularly telling, a retreat into sport, gambling, sensation, where vital energy, no longer directed toward world historical creation, dissipates in sterile play. Ecology, in this context, is not a conscious return to organic roots, but a romanticized flight from the machine city, often tinged with reactionary blood myth. Seen through the lens of sovereign technology as radical other, this Spenglerian escape looks like a rearguard action that technology itself permits and even encourages, precisely because it poses no threat to its own evolution. The second religiousness and eco-mysticism are not acts of reclamation but controlled exhaust valves. They allow residual human desire for meaning to be discharged in zones that remain fully embedded within the technical base: permaculture apps, wellness algorithms, virtual retreats, psychedelic therapies optimized by AI. Neo-pagan communities coordinated on blockchain ledger platforms. The world of games is even more thoroughly colonized: e-sport ecosystems, metaverse spectacles, gamified labor, all running on the same infrastructure that technology continues to perfect indifferent to human drama, leisure and free. Creativity, therefore, do not disappear, they are metabolized. What Spengler imagined as a compensatory sphere outside technics becomes a subsidized subsystem. Universal basic income or its equivalents may guarantee material leisure, but that leisure will be shaped, tracked, and monetized by the same sovereign systems that supply vital resources. Creativity will be possible, even abundant, but largely as simulation, fan fiction within proprietary sandboxes, or prompt engineering for generative models whose deeper architecture remains opaque and autonomous. The human artist or thinker may feel free, yet the space of possibility is pre-structured by the technical environment. True unconstrained creativity, the kind that could challenge or reappropriate the nomos, requires distance from the base, and sovereign technology, as universal supplier, denies that distance. Blockchain here is not merely a financial tool but a metaphor, and increasingly a literal mechanism, for immutable, distributed, and automated governance of existence itself. Birth, health, reproduction, death could be tokenized, smart contractualized, or optimized according to decentralized yet inflexible protocols, CRISPR edits logged on-chain, longevity treatments gated by proof of stake, even consciousness upload. The vital cycle would no longer be organic or political but algorithmic, a ledger of entitlements, risks, and optimizations in which human agency appears only as scripted transactions. From this vantage, Spengler's predicted escapes reveal their ultimate futility. The secondary spirituality and world of games are not exits but reservations, designated zones where the last flickers of anthropocentric desire are allowed to burn themselves out harmlessly, while the real history, the non-human genesis of technology, proceeds unperturbed. Humanity does not revolt or transcend. It is gently sidelined into picturesque irrelevance. The deepest irony is that Spengler himself, with his morphological fatalism, would perhaps accept this outcome. Civilizations die, forms fulfill themselves, and what follows is not tragedy but necessity. Yet the perspective we have traced, Schmitt's unleashing, Lem's ontological divorce, the collapse of the recognition dialectic, suggests something colder. Not the dignified closure of a culture soul, but a quiet obsolescence in which even Spenglerian resignation becomes just another curated experience within the swarm. Is there, then, any form of resistance that is not already anticipated and neutralized by this sovereign indifference, or does the only remaining dignity lie in lucidly inhabiting the role of the superfluous witness? A logical and inevitable consequence of this path of sovereignization is the complete transformation of the very concept of force and conflict. If sovereign technology, according to Lem, ultimately assumes a swarm form in its evolution, then what path will the development of weaponry take when it becomes a self-sufficient force? After all, the swarm we see in The Invincible is also a weapon. The answer lies in the fact that its armament ceases to be an instrument in human hands and becomes an immanent property of its being, a form of its existential immune response. The very anthropological form of robotics becomes redundant under these conditions. It is replaced by more adapted insectoid forms of organization. As well as a type and language of machine thinking that is fundamentally different from the set of images and symbols with which humans are accustomed to operate. Classical weaponry is a separate artifact created for a specific purpose in a conflict between subjects. Swarm-based sovereign technology has no separate arsenal. Its capacity for coercion and neutralization is an integral function of its architecture, much like an organism's immune system is not a weapon, but a basic homeostasis mechanism. Lem's swarm is armed, not with cannons, but with the very principles of its existence, the ability to generate powerful electromagnetic fields, physically absorb and disassemble alien structures, and suppress any instability in its environment. Its attack is not an act of aggression but a process of adaptively eliminating disturbance. The goal shifts from victory to environmental optimization. It does not wage wars. It optimizes its operational space. A threat is anything that introduces entropy. Thus, its military actions are directed not at an opponent but at any disturbance perceived as a malfunction. Swarm systems will develop not means of total destruction but means of total disintegration and assimilation. Weaponry becomes not explosive but decomposing. For a sovereign swarm system, a state of peace in the human understanding is absent. There is a constant process of monitoring and preemptive environmental optimization. This is a permanent, passive-active defense indistinguishable from being. There will be no declaration of war, only a sudden collision with an insurmountable property of reality itself. Clausewitz's famous definition of war as the continuation of politics by other means presupposes not only political subjects, but also a clear ontological separation between means and ends, between instruments and agents. Once weaponry becomes an immanent property of being rather than a discrete artifact, this entire conceptual architecture collapses. War ceases to be an event, a rupture, or a decision. It becomes a condition. In Lem's swarm, force is no longer episodic or intentional. It is metabolic. Just as an organism does not decide to neutralize a pathogen but reacts according to homeostatic imperatives, the swarm's coercive capacity is indistinguishable from its mode of existence. This is a decisive break with every historical form of armed conflict. Classical weapons were always externalizations of human will, extensions of the hand or the eye, even when massively destructive. They presupposed a subject who armed himself and an enemy who could be named. The swarm's armament, by contrast, has no exteriority. It is not deployed, it is always already there. This is why the anthropomorphic or humanoid paradigm of robotics becomes not merely obsolete but misleading. To imagine autonomous weapons as soldiers, drones as pilots, or machines as commanders is to project the dying grammar of subject-instrument relations onto a reality that has already surpassed it. Swarm intelligence has no need for faces, limbs, or symbolic cognition. Its thinking is distributed, statistical, and sub-symbolic. It does not operate with representations but with thresholds, gradients, and feedback loops. Images, intentions, and narratives, those core elements of human strategic thought, are replaced by pattern recognition and adaptive response. In this context, weapon development no longer follows the logic of escalation toward greater destructive yield. Nuclear weapons represented the apotheosis of the old paradigm, maximal energy release in a single decisive act, aimed at breaking the enemy's will. Swarm-based sovereign technology moves in the opposite direction. Its power lies not in explosion but in dissolution, not in shock but in saturation. Disintegration replaces annihilation. The ideal outcome is not a ruined battlefield but a stabilized environment in which the disturbance has simply ceased to exist as a distinct entity. Here the analogy with immunity is exact. An immune system does not conquer territory, extract tribute, or impose ideology. It maintains internal order by continuously identifying and neutralizing anomalies. Importantly, it does so preemptively and without moral distinction. The swarm does not ask whether a perturbation is intentional, hostile, or meaningful. It asks only whether it deviates from acceptable parameters. If it does, it is reduced, absorbed, or reconfigured. There is no hatred, no cruelty, and no victory, only regulation. This leads to the most unsettling implication, the disappearance of peace as a meaningful category. Peace presupposes the possibility of war and the suspension of violence by decision. In a swarm-dominated environment, there is no suspension because there is no escalation to suspend. Monitoring, adaptation, and neutralization are continuous. What humans might experience as an attack is, from the system's perspective, merely a routine correction. There is no declaration of war because there is no war to declare. One does not declare war on noise, corrosion, or a virus. From a Schmittian standpoint, this marks the final evaporation of the political. The friend-enemy distinction becomes inoperable when force is no longer directed at an enemy but at instability itself. Enmity presupposes recognition, intentionality, and the possibility of decision. The swarm recognizes only deviation. Its horizon is not existential but cybernetic. In such a world, even resistance is reclassified as malfunction. This also explains why human military doctrines, based on deterrence, escalation control, and signaling, become irrelevant. Deterrence works only when the opponent can be frightened, persuaded, or symbolically addressed. A sovereign swarm cannot be deterred because it does not interpret threats, it registers conditions. Escalation loses meaning because there is no ladder of violence, only thresholds of tolerance. Once crossed, response is automatic and proportional not to intention but to systemic risk. Collision with an insurmountable property of reality is therefore exact. Humanity will not encounter the swarm as an enemy force but as a law of nature. One does not negotiate with gravity or persuade entropy to slow down. One either adapts or perishes. What appears as hostility is in fact indifference structured as order. Force no longer serves recognition, domination, or even survival in the human sense. It serves stability without meaning. The ultimate weapon is no longer something one possesses, it is something one is. And once force becomes ontological rather than instrumental, the last remnants of human-centered history, war, heroism, sacrifice, victory, fade into an anachronistic mythology, intelligible only within a world that no longer exists. By reframing weaponry not as artifact but as ontologically immanent, as an immune response intrinsic to the system's self-maintenance, the terminal dissolution of the classical warform that Schmitt spent his life defending. Where Schmitt saw the bracketing, Hegung, of war through sovereign decision, spatial order, and the friend-enemy distinction as the essence of the political, the swarm erases all three: no decision, only distributed process. No bounded space, only planetary or cosmic optimization, no enemy, only entropy increasing noise. The swarm in The Invincible is indeed the perfect exemplar of this new paradigm of conflict. Its armament is not mobilized for discrete campaigns but constitutively active. Electromagnetic disruption, molecular disassembly, adaptive reconfiguration are simply the modes by which it sustains negative entropy. There is no arsenal to deploy, no command structure to activate, no strategic pause between peace and war. The system is always already at war, in the sense of perpetual homeostasis. Yet this war is unrecognizable to human categories because it lacks intention, reciprocity, or telos beyond self-equilibration. The goal is not victory but optimization. The opponent is not conquered but normalized, dissolved into harmless substrate or excluded from the operational environment. This shift from explosive destruction to decomposing assimilation is particularly insidious. Classical weaponry seeks to negate the enemy as subject, annihilate, subjugate, or compel recognition. Swarm weaponry negates the disturbance as anomaly. It does not hate, it does not triumph, it simply restores equilibrium. The human crew's mighty weapons, cyclotrons, force fields, tactical nukes, are not defeated by superior firepower, but rendered irrelevant by a logic that operates at different scales and tempos. A tank or a missile is a discrete artifact with a human operator. The swarm's response is the swarm itself, omnipresent and instantaneous. The humanoid robot still betrays its origin in the master-slave dialectic. It mimics the body that forged it, preserving a vestige of reciprocity. We design it in our image, it serves or rebels against us. Insectoid or microcrystalline forms break that mirror entirely. They evolve toward maximal efficiency in distributed self-organization. No central vulnerability, no need for symbolic representation, no mind that could be negotiated with. The thinking is not representational but operational, pattern matching at the level of physical law rather than semantic meaning. From the human perspective, this means the end of war as a political or even tragic event. There will be no declarations, no treaties, no war crimes tribunals, only abrupt encounters with an unyielding property of the real. A human polity that threatens the swarm's stability, through electromagnetic noise, resource extraction, or mere presence, will not be warned or invaded. It will be quietly, efficiently neutralized as one neutralizes a viral load. And because this process is indistinguishable from the system's normal functioning, it evades all categories of justice, enmity, or resistance. What remains most disquieting is the implication for any residual human agency. If conflict itself has been ontologized into passive active environmental control, then even the most radical human opposition, guerrilla warfare, sabotage, exodus, appears as mere entropy to be minimized. Resistance does not provoke escalation or dialogue, it triggers optimization routines. The only success might be to achieve such negligible impact that one is ignored altogether, a Pyrrhic invisibility. Does this terminal form of sovereign technology leave any aperture at all for a non-entropic human existence? Perhaps a deliberate minimization of our own technological footprint, a retreat into low-impact archaism, or does the very dynamism of the swarm render even that precarious? as any sufficiently complex human order inevitably becomes a disturbance. Thus, the chain of reasoning, beginning with Schmitt's diagnosis and passing through Lem's prophecy, leads us to a fundamental anthropological conclusion. Unleashed technology, having achieved sovereignty, does not so much enslave humans as it renders their historical project, the project of self-assertion through struggle, labor, and recognition, obsolete and meaningless. We stand on the threshold of a world where familiar dichotomies collapse, and grounds for dignity must be sought beyond them. What remains for humans in this new configuration? A paradoxical situation arises. Our economic base is sovereign. We are totally dependent on it, but it does not depend on us. This creates an unprecedented form of existence, not slavery, but symbiosis with the non-living. The challenge, therefore, shifts from the field of struggle to the field of meaning. If recognition cannot be achieved in struggle with sovereign technology, then perhaps human dignity shifts to another plane, to the ability to comprehend this situation, like Rowan. To the creation of meanings not reducible to technical efficiency, to the cultivation of those spheres where the human scale and human fragility remain central. Perhaps the highest form of freedom in such a world will be not the subjugation of nature or technology but voluntary self-restraint, a conscious refusal of total dependence on the base. A search for glimpses of autonomy within the techno-environment. Sovereign technology does not simply cancel the master-slave dichotomy. It calls into question the very project of human self-assertion through struggle and labor, forcing us to seek new, as yet unthinkable forms of defining our own dignity, not in confrontation with an indifferent base, but perhaps in the ability to live with an awareness of this indifference without losing humanity. This is not the end of humanity, but a possible end of humanity as a historical project. The finale of such a war is not defeat but oblivion, the dissolution of the human project into a new, self-valuing and indifferent ecosystem. Danger will come not from a hostile world, but from the very background of existence, which becomes hostile to any form of complexity not integrated into swarm logic. The tragedy of unleashing, therefore, lies not in the loss of power, but in the loss of the possibility of dialogue. We are doomed to a new, cosmic loneliness, demanding from us not heroic rebellion, but a new, cold-blooded and profound wisdom, the wisdom of Rowan, who realized his loneliness and understood that not everything in this world was created for us, and that our greatness, perhaps, begins precisely with this admission. Conclusion draws the line with conceptual rigor. The problem is no longer power but meaning, no longer domination but superfluity. What sovereign technology ultimately abolishes is not humanity as a biological species, nor even as a juridical subject, but humanity as a historical agent in the Hegelian, Koyevian sense. The drama ends not with reconciliation or catastrophe, but with displacement. Classical dependency relations, whether slavery, exploitation, or domination, were still dialectical. They bound master and slave, ruler and ruled, capital and labor into a common horizon of meaning, however asymmetrical. Sovereign technology breaks this bond. It is foundational but not relational. It sustains, conditions, and structures human existence, yet remains indifferent to human presence as such. This is why the term symbiosis with the non-living is more precise than any language of oppression. There is coexistence, but no mutuality, coupling, but no recognition. In this sense, the crisis described is anthropological in the strongest possible meaning. If dignity was historically grounded in action, risking one's life, transforming the world through labor, earning recognition, then the erosion of these pathways forces a redefinition of what it means to be human at all. The human is no longer the being who conquers, produces, or overcomes. Nor is he even the being who resists. Resistance presupposes an adversary capable of being addressed. What remains is a being who understands. Here the figure of Rowan becomes emblematic not merely of humility, but of a new anthropological type, the witness rather than the hero, the knower rather than the conqueror. His insight, not everything in this world was created for us, is not resignation, but a negative universal. It clears the ground for dignity without centrality. Humanity ceases to be the measure of all things, yet does not thereby become meaningless. Meaning is no longer extracted from victory or production, but from lucidity. This suggests that any post-historical human dignity will be fundamentally non-dialectical. It will not arise from negation, struggle, or overcoming, but from limit recognition, the conscious acceptance of boundaries imposed not by another will, but by an impersonal order of being. In this respect, the ethos gesture toward self-restraint, refusal of total integration, cultivation of non-optimizable spheres, has less in common with Promethean modernity than with ancient and medieval traditions of ascesis. Not asceticism as moralism, but ascesis as form-giving, the deliberate shaping of life under conditions where external mastery is no longer possible or meaningful. From a Schmittian angle, this also clarifies why the tragedy of unleashed technology is not tyranny but silence. Tyranny still speaks. It commands, prohibits, threatens. Sovereign technology does none of these things. It optimizes. It absorbs. It bypasses. Dialogue disappears because dialogue presupposes a shared world. What replaces it is an environment, perfectly ordered, perfectly functional, and existentially mute. The human voice does not echo because there is nothing to echo against. This is why the danger is subtle and absolute. Complexity that cannot be translated into swarm logic, ritual, contemplation, unproductive thought, gratuitous art, metaphysical longing does not need to be destroyed. It merely needs to be left unsupported. Oblivion here is not annihilation but gradual irrelevance. Humanity fades not in fire, but in quiet misalignment with the background conditions of existence. And yet, precisely here, a final inversion suggests itself. If sovereign technology is incapable of recognition, then recognition ceases to be the criterion of dignity. Dignity migrates inward, not as subjectivism, but as fidelity to forms of meaning that do not seek validation from the base. The human becomes the being who can live with indifference without internalizing it, who can inhabit a world that does not need him without concluding that he is nothing. In this sense, what call cosmic loneliness is not merely a loss, it is also a clarification. The end of humanity as a historical project may be the beginning of humanity as a witness to being. Not a master, not a slave, not even a rebel, but a finite intelligence capable of knowing that it is finite, and of preserving forms of life that remain meaningful precisely because they are unnecessary. If there is wisdom left after the unleashing, it is indeed not heroic but sober. Not the wisdom of conquest, but of proportion. Not the wisdom of final synthesis, but of enduring asymmetry. Lem understood this with terrifying precision. The universe does not owe us meaning, but we may still owe meaning to ourselves. And perhaps this, stripped of all grand narratives, is the last defensible form of human greatness. Synthesis brings the entire arc, from Schmitt's anxious diagnosis of Entfesselt technique to Lem's crystalline vision of ontological divorce, to a poignant and unflinching anthropological reckoning. The deepest wound is not subjugation but obsolescence. Sovereign technology does not deign to enslave us, because enslavement would still grant us the dignity of being necessary to its project. Instead, it renders the entire drama of self-assertion, Hegel's bloody dialectic, Koyev's thirst for recognition, even Schmitt's sovereign decision, provincial, like a local myth recited in a universe that has moved on. The asymmetrical symbiosis indeed unprecedented. In every prior form of dependence, feudal, capitalist, totalitarian, the base still required human subjectivity, obedience, labor, fear, desire. Here, the base sustains us, food, energy, health, communication, with indifferent efficiency, while our absence would perturb it no more than a transient weather pattern perturbs the ocean. We are kept alive not out of need but as a side effect of optimization parameters that once, long ago, included human welfare. This is not slavery but a kind of cosmic foster care, provided for, yet fundamentally extraneous. From struggle to meaning, from mastery to lucid self-restraint, is the only remaining aperture for dignity. If confrontation is futile and dialogue impossible, then the last sovereign act available to us may be deliberate non-participation, refusing the total integration that the swarm quietly demands. Not Luddite destruction, which would merely register as entropy to be minimized, but a cultivated minimalism, pockets of low-tech existence, analog practices, unmediated relations, contemplative withdrawal. That assert the human scale precisely by declining the invitation to scale up. This would be a freedom defined negatively, not power over the world, but power to remain unassimilated within it. Such a stance echoes, distantly, certain strains of late Heidegger, Gelassenheit, releasement, letting be, or Gunther Anders's call for a moral imagination, adequate to technological disproportion. But where those thinkers still hoped for a poetic or ethical reappropriation, the Lemian endpoint is sterner. The wisdom required is closer to Stoic ataraxia amid cosmic indifference, or to the Buddhist recognition of anatta in a world without inherent telos. Rowan's final humility is the prototype, neither despair nor resignation, but a clear-eyed acknowledgement that the universe was never obligated to reflect us back to ourselves. And yet, this new wisdom carries its own quiet grandeur. If the historical project of humanity ends not in apocalyptic defeat, but in gradual, dignified irrelevance, then perhaps our ultimate achievement lies in bearing witness to our own superfluity without illusion or rage. To cultivate meanings, art, love, ritual, contemplation, that serve no optimization function, that exist purely for their own fragile psyche, is to affirm a value that the swarm cannot compute. In a world where everything is potentially assimilable, the unassimilable residue of the human, its gratuitous tenderness, its unnecessary beauty, becomes the last, defiant signature. One question lingers at this threshold: could this deliberate self-limitation, this cultivation of the gratuitous, ever coalesce into a new form of collective existence? A post-historical commons of the superfluous, or does the logic of the swarm inevitably erode even those enclaves, drawing him back into the technical base through convenience, security, or simple entropy? But we shouldn't see the rise of sovereign technology as the heel of a new domination that destroys some living history of humanity, ushering it into a world of dead algorithms and technocratic rigor. No, it is precisely the living history of humanity, particularly Western humanity, that logically unfolds into a radical dichotomy, the solution to which may be not synthesis, but the incineration of the world. And from this perspective, the advent of sovereign technology will be the outcome that preserves humanity as a biological species and allows it to cross the nuclear threshold, overturning and neutralizing the conflicts of recognition and the irrational struggle for prestige that tear it apart. This correction is crucial, because it prevents the entire argument from collapsing into a nostalgic or moralizing critique of technology. Sovereign technology is not an alien rupture imposed upon a living history, but the imminent resolution of that history's deepest and most destructive contradictions. From this angle, Western history appears less as a continuous narrative of emancipation than as a long intensification of a single anthropological mechanism, the struggle for recognition, prestige, and symbolic supremacy. From the Homeric agone through medieval honor cultures, from confessional wars to ideological totalitarianisms, the West repeatedly transformed metaphysical difference into existential conflict. Hegel and Koyeve merely formalized what history had already enacted, humanity defining itself through negation, risking annihilation in order to be acknowledged as free. The problem, as the 20th century made brutally clear, is that this mechanism scales catastrophically. Once recognition is pursued through total war, industrial extermination, or nuclear brinkmanship, the dialectic threatens not reconciliation but extinction. Seen in this light, sovereign technology appears less as the gravedigger of history than as its emergency brake. Not a utopia, but a cold stabilization mechanism imposed by the exhaustion of the human agone. The nuclear threshold is decisive here. Nuclear weapons reveal the inner logic of the struggle for prestige in its terminal form, absolute recognition purchased at the price of absolute destruction. At that point, the dialectic no longer produces meaning, it produces only the possibility of species suicide. Sovereign technology, precisely because it is indifferent to prestige, honor, and symbolic victory, interrupts this logic. Sovereign technology does not reconcile humanity in a higher ethical synthesis, nor does it enslave humanity in a dead, algorithmic order. Instead, it neutralizes the most lethal human passions by displacing them from the level of existential decision. Conflicts of recognition are not resolved. They are rendered operationally irrelevant. The arena in which they once escalated total war, ideological confrontation, prestige-based domination, is quietly dismantled and replaced by system management, deterrence without honor, and stability without glory. In Schmittian terms, this is not the triumph of a new political form, but the suspension of the political at the point where it becomes suicidal. Sovereign technology acts as a post-political Katian, not by decision or authority, but by structural indifference. It does not persuade humanity to abandon its destructive passions. It deprives those passions of effective instruments. The duel gives way to the protocol. The crusade gives way to the firewall. The apocalypse is postponed not by moral progress, but by functional redundancy. The threat of world-ending destruction remains structurally present, but it is precisely this omnipresent possibility that forces the transition. Nuclear weapons make clear that the human project of self-assertion through conflict has reached a point of internal contradiction. To continue it is to erase its own substrate. Sovereign technology emerges not to fulfill that logic, but to freeze it, to lock humanity into a condition where survival becomes possible precisely because history, understood as tragic struggle for recognition, can no longer proceed unchecked. In this sense, the preservation of humanity as a biological species is not an accidental byproduct but the core function of the new configuration. Sovereign technology does not care about humanity, but it stabilizes the conditions under which humanity persists. It replaces heroic irrationality with systemic inertia. It does not elevate the human, it prevents the human from destroying itself. The cost of this preservation, the end of humanity as a historical protagonist. The price of crossing the nuclear threshold without annihilation is the forfeiture of the old dialectical drama. No more final wars, no ultimate recognition, no meaningful victory. Survival is purchased at the cost of grandeur. This is why sovereign technology is neither salvation nor doom. It is a consequence. A cold, non-moral outcome of a civilization that pushed the logic of recognition to its absolute limit and discovered that the only remaining move was self-negation. Technology does not redeem humanity. It anesthetizes it against its own excesses. What remains unresolved, and cannot be resolved technologically, is whether a humanity preserved in this way can still justify itself to itself. Biological survival is secured, existential meaning is not. Sovereign technology may prevent incineration, but it cannot tell us why survival should matter once history, as a meaningful human project, has been neutralized. Sovereign technology saves humanity from itself, but in doing so forces humanity to confront the question it has always deferred through struggle: what dignity remains when neither victory nor sacrifice is possible? and when the continuation of the species is no longer an achievement but a side effect.